So last week, I started reading through the 2022 Australian Workplace Equality Index Evidence and Scoring Guideline document. This is a supplementary document to the forms that companies submit each year in Australia in order to be scored on their progress toward LGBTQI+ inclusion, or at least scored on their progress toward that inclusion according to ACON's Pride and Diversity Group, who administer the scheme. The reason I started reading this document was that I was meeting with someone who opposed a University of Melbourne event addressing the participation of public bodies, including universities, in the Australian Workplace Equality Index. So I wanted to have my ducks in a row to defend the event against their criticism by explaining the various conflicts of interest I see participation in the AWEI creating for workplaces. Now, I didn't at the time make it all the way through the document because it runs to over 20,000 words across 50 pages. But fortuitously, the Women's Action Group got in touch to say that they were organising a Speaker's Corner event about gender identity ideology impacting law and policy. So I decided to finish my reading of the document in order to put together a speech for that event. So I'll post the link in the video description to that speech and indeed to the whole Speaker's Corner event. But it was a very truncated version of what I ended up writing. So in this longer video, I'm going to go through the potential conflicts of interest created by a number of different items in the 2022 AWEI, submissions for which closed earlier this year in February. And I'm going to pay particular attention to where I see a connection between the AWEI and changes my own employer, the University of Melbourne, has made in recent years. Although, of course, this connection between these two things could turn out to be a tremendous coincidence. Now, before I start, I want to acknowledge the huge amount of work done on ACON's AWEI by the Australian feminist Kit Kowalski. I think most of us here who know about this issue have come to it via her work. So I'll also post links in the video description to her talk earlier this year at the Brisbane Meanjin International Women's Day event and to her blog, which you see here. And also to the Come Out of ACON Twitter campaign. And I would also encourage anyone who is new to this topic to watch last night's ABC Media Watch coverage of this issue. It talks about both the University of Melbourne event and the sort of potential conflicts of interest of the Pride and Diversity AWEI in general. And also to listen to the Nolan Investigates podcast series produced by the BBC out of the UK, because that explores the parallel issues in the UK, where a number of public bodies began withdrawing from the Stonewall Diversity Champions scheme after the podcast brought to a much wider audience the tensions with impartiality and public trust of having companies essentially paying lobby groups to lobby them. At the end of this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about where I think the blame lies, whether it's with the Pride and Diversity Group for the AWEI, or whether it's with the individual companies that sign up to this scheme. After all, the scheme is voluntary. Okay, so the AWEI submission, and so the guidelines to accompany the submission, it's separated into two sections. The first is a standing submission, which can be rolled over. So if a company does well in terms of its points on that section, it can just choose to roll the whole thing over to the subsequent year and only complete section 2, which has annual collection and the items change. So I'll talk first about the standing submission, section 1, and then I'll go on to the annual submission, section 2. So let's start with item 7. And I know you won't be able to read this, but I'll zoom in when I get there. So item 7, hopefully you can see that okay. So that is LGBTQ training of HR or grievance officers. So workplaces are encouraged in this item to have clear pathways for LGBTQ people to report bullying or harassment, and for the person who they're reporting it to be experienced allies of LGBTQ people or to be trained in LGBTQ inclusion. Now, this might sound innocuous. Of course, it wouldn't be very useful for diversity and inclusion if there was lots of bullying and harassment of LGBTQ people, and then the person responsible for taking complaints was themselves illiterate in what counts as such bullying and harassment. But we know that gender identity activists count as bullying and or harassment things that a reasonable person probably wouldn't. We also know that to count as a TQ ally means to be signed on to a great deal of controversial ideology, central to which is the denial of the importance of sex. So this item, I think, risks the targeting of employees for speech or action that is and should be protected by academic freedom, freedom of speech, and or protected attributes under the Equal Opportunity Act, including religious belief and political belief. Of course, the academic freedom is going to apply to universities, but not to other kinds of employers. So just to apply this to my workplace, last year the University of Melbourne advertised for a senior advisor gender affirmation, and in the position description they said that this person would be facilitating the making of complaints. And they do seem to have hired this person. At least there is someone on LinkedIn listed with a job starting in January this year called Senior Advisor Gender Diversity. And I don't know what effect this has had. And it's worth noting that it's unlikely that anyone would know because the complaints processes have confidentiality requirements attached to them. It's also hard to anticipate the chilling effect this may have on speech within the university, whether in the classroom, in research, or in criticism of the university, which is protected by our enterprise agreement. So it doesn't need to be that anyone is actually being disciplined for wrong speak for it to be that the threat of being disciplined is having a silencing effect. And item 7, as you'll see here, gets UniMelb 3 points, or any employer who's participating. And just to keep this number in proportion, note that the total score possible this year was 200, and over 100 is required for achievement. So bronze this year required 107 points, silver required 155 points, and gold required 174 points. And the ABC received gold status this year with a score of 177 out of 200 points. Going on to item 8, which is related to item 7. This asks for the workplace to give clear examples of what counts as bullying and harassment on the grounds of gender identity and or gender expression. So workplaces get extra points for giving detailed examples that are separate for the 3 groups. So for sexual orientation, you see them here, for gender diversity or trans people, and then for intersex people. Now, the University of Melbourne recently introduced a gender affirmation policy, which gives 5 examples of unlawful or inappropriate behaviour, including harassment and bullying. And these include A, deliberately and or persistently using incorrect names or pronouns after an individual's correct name or pronouns have been made clear. And item E, ridiculing, excluding, humiliating, or ignoring a person because of their gender identity or expression. So these would surely count as detailed examples. The policy also encourages members of the university community to use the grievance process to make complaints against any staff who experience or observe another member of the community doing these things. But note that B compels women to call men she and her whenever those men are willing to claim a gender identity, and even if those men have been her workplace bully or sexual harasser. And it makes it a disciplinary offence for women to exclude, that's in item E, men on the basis of their sex, because those men can then claim that they were excluded on the basis of their gender identity instead. And whether this is related or not, the university now offers its women-only training opportunities, such as the Academic Women in Leadership program, and all of its women-only jobs to women understood on the basis of gender identity, not sex, even though it's sex that has caused the exclusions that the programs and jobs are attempting to correct for. Satisfying item 8 would get UniMelb or any other employer 4 points. Jumping ahead to item 11, which is gender affirmation policy, which I've already just mentioned. So item 11 encourages the having of a dedicated gender affirmation policy and calling it that, and that is worth 5 points. Now UniMelb has one mentioned already, and it does 3 things that I think create a conflict of interest with women specifically. First, it welcomes trans and gender diverse people to use whichever bathrooms they like. So even though the university has actually established 215 all-gender bathrooms across campus, which relates to another separate item in the AWEI, the university also goes ahead and removes sex-separated spaces for women by welcoming males who identify as women or as non-binary into those bathrooms. So that's the first thing that the gender affirmation policy does. Second, and mentioned already, it makes preferred names, pronouns, and descriptors mandatory, including when the person isn't there. So for example, 2 gender-critical employees who refer to their trans woman colleague as he when it's just them talking can be reported for inappropriate workplace behaviour if they are overheard. And third, the policy allows the university to shut down public events on the grounds of threats to the safety and well-being of staff and students. Now that point is made within a section of the policy saying that the policy is meant to be consistent with the expression of views relating to gender identity. So it's clear that at least in principle, the university could invoke trans students' well-being in order to close down an event. Thankfully though, just returning to this event, it did not in fact use those grounds to shut down the Pride and Prejudice event. So we can hope that the policy only means to refer to genuine safety concerns, for example, protests that pose a serious risk of physical violence. It's really not clear who to blame for the silly policy here. So the AWEI is in fact only asking for a gender affirmation policy in this item. And that doesn't require any removing of single-sex spaces, compelling of speech, or control over public events, again where that's relevant to the employer. But points are awarded based on the specific policy. So workplaces, I think, are still responding to incentives that are put in place by the scheme, even if they end up going further than the scheme explicitly asked for. Okay, item 13 is gender affirmation leave. Now this is not a direct conflict of interest, but it is annoying because it asks for trans and gender diverse employees to be given additional paid leave compared against other employees. So a woman working full-time will get about 10 days a year in sick leave, which isn't even enough to have 1 day off a month per painful period, for example, let alone all the other things that she might in principle be dealing with. A man who decides he's a woman can access additional leave to affirm his identity, whatever that actually means or requires. And if it's medical appointments, then why isn't that just a type of sick leave like anyone else might need? UniMelb's gender affirmation policy is actually a bit cagey on whether we've granted this additional leave or not. It directs inquiries about leave to the new senior advisor, gender affirmation. And offering this leave is worth 4 points. Item 14, which I mentioned already, there's a separate item for, refers to gender neutral bathrooms and calling them that rather than calling them unisex. And as I've mentioned already, this doesn't actually require that all the workplace's bathrooms be gender neutral. It only requires that there are some gender neutral bathrooms. And this is worth 4 points. UniMelb has satisfied this item by adding hundreds of gender neutral bathrooms. But as I said already, it's also gone further than this, making all bathrooms open to the choice of a trans or gender diverse employee through the gender affirmation policy. Item 15 refers to internal documents and forms that collect gender information, and it asks for non-binary options and trans options to be included. But what's interesting here is that one way of earning full points on this item, which is 2 points, is to simply stop collecting gender information entirely. And then the next item is very similar to that. So item 16, which refers to the collection of information through the company's IT systems. Similarly, you can achieve this item just by stopping collecting gender information altogether, and again, that's worth 2 points. Recently, UniMelb announced that students can now access inclusive gender options in Student 1, which is the student system. And when asked, the relevant staff confirmed that this gender identity information replaces sex information. And that means the university is no longer collecting accurate data on sex, and that means they won't be able to monitor progress toward sex equality across different subjects or in study outcomes. And this, I think, is a very clear case, perhaps the clearest in the whole AWEI, of a conflict of interest between what the AWEI is incentivizing for LGBTQ+ inclusion and the inclusion of women. So the AWEI is incentivizing employers to stop collecting sex data, and this hinders the monitoring of sex equality. Item 17 is about trans and gender diverse job applicants and having clear information about their inclusion. It's not specified exactly how this must go, but I would note that UniMelb seems to have gotten into the habit of advertising women-only scholarships as open to trans and non-binary people, and women-only jobs as the same. As in, they have created a conflict of interest in the way they seem to be satisfying this item. Because instead of just making clear that trans people are welcome and encouraged to apply to any job, which is what they generally do for other minority groups, they have also started adding trans people of the relevant gender identity into jobs and scholarships offered to women, understood as female people. And as mentioned already, this doesn't always make sense in light of the reasons for having women-only jobs and scholarships in the first place. Item 19 is having a dedicated diversity employee whose job description is to work toward LGBTQ+ inclusion objectives. And this is only worth 2 points, despite the likely salary costs involved. I can't see any evidence that UniMelb has this for LGBTQ in general, but there is the Senior Advisor Gender Diversity mentioned already, which the AWEI may take to be sufficient given that several sections of the forms are dedicated to trans and gender diverse inclusion alone. And again, this creates a potential conflict of interest if the person working in this role goes beyond equalities, so for example, making sure there's no discrimination in the workplace against LGBTQ people, if they go beyond this into ideology. So for example, bringing gender identity ideology in as a requirement for people to subscribe to, rather than merely being one of a set of controversial beliefs among many that people have the freedom to hold. Okay, those are the items I wanted to comment on in the standing submission section. And the last set of things I wanted to comment on are in the annual submission section, which I think is different every year. So the numbering restarts at 1 here. Just if you're jumping around the video, that might be important. So item 1, as you see here, encourages the use of an external expert to advise workplaces on LGBTQ inclusion. And that expert can be Pride and Diversity itself. And satisfying this is worth 2 points. Again, we have the risk of this bringing ideology with it in the advice that is given, and the way that it may clash with other minority groups' interests. So obviously UniMelb does use Pride and Diversity, and it actually says in its LGBTIQA+ action plan online that its plan is explicitly informed by the AWEI. Item 3, which starts here, is LGBTQ advisory group. And that is about establishing and promoting an internal LGBTQ advisory group. And again, like several of the other items, in principle, this would be fine. So in principle, having LGBTQ employees who could be consulted on LGBTQ inclusion strategy, that seems like a fine idea. But again, in practice, with TQ ideology and activism as it is, it means not only people who are LGB or T or Q, but also people with a specific set of ideological commitments, giving advice in an utterly predictable way, which generates conflicts of interest with the interests of women and LGB people, if not other minority groups in the workplace too, such as religious groups. So to be fair to the PID, the Pride and Diversity group, they might intend for those networks to be genuinely representative of the employee population. It might just be that those who are motivated to join such networks tend to be those with the ideological beliefs. Or it might be that those kinds of groups squash dissent and push out anyone who doesn't have the right beliefs, and so they always end up being ideological in this predictable way. And arguably, and this is something I'll get to at the end of the video, this is something that the workplace should be monitoring, rather than that the AWEI itself is necessarily to blame for rewarding. Jumping ahead a bit, all of the items are from 9 through to 20, so you just see them skimming by. Maybe I'll just stop here. So 9 through 20, these are all about having LGBTQ employee networks, such as a staff pride network. So having a network at all, to go back to 9, is worth 2 points. Having an HR person in the leadership of that network is worth 3 points. And I can't remember who pointed this out at the UniMelb event. I think it might have been Linda Gale, which was that having an HR person in a staff network in the first place is kind of anathema to unionists. It's worth, is that here? 2 points for having a strategy to catch new LGBTQ people at onboarding. It's worth 3 points to have distributed material about how to be an ally to trans people, or to have done work to profile trans speakers or role models. It's worth 3 points to make LGBTQ women more visible. And it's worth 3 points as well for making LGBTQ people plus some other minority group intersection more visible. And then finally, I can't remember which item that was, but it'll be somewhere before 20. There's 3 points for increasing, yeah, I think it's this one, 19, 3 points for increasing the LGBTQ presence in other diversity networks. Yeah, so that's there. And that would include any women's groups, for example. And again, as I think I keep saying, this could all be innocuous. But given what we know the TQ ideology is like, we know that having a homogenous LGBTQ network in the first place is likely to mean pushing out anyone who disagrees with TQ ideology. We've seen that happening in the Greens, for example, or in Labour. Some of us who know the Staff Pride networks on campus have watched that happen, or in our own workplaces. We know that, or we can predict that, encouraging the Staff Pride network to distribute ally material about trans people is likely to mean encouraging beliefs that are ideological. We can predict that increasing the profile of LGBTQ+ women, just back in this item, it's not likely to end up meaning lesbians. It's likely to end up meaning men with gender identities. And then that means it's going to end up ruining women's networks. So on that item 19, where we talked about getting LGBTQ representation into other networks, that's going to end up hijacking or subverting those networks by pushing men with gender identities into them under the guise of diversity. So it's hijacking the agenda of those groups, like women's groups within organizations that should be focusing on their own constituencies. Now, if we jump ahead to items 21, 22, and then 28. So 21 is celebrating days of significance, right? So for example, Trans Day of Remembrance. Item 22 is all about visibility in the workplace, so signaling things like having email signatures, LGBTQ rainbow lanyards, having pronouns in emails or on social media bios, having rainbow Zoom backgrounds or the inclusive pride flag as the Zoom backgrounds, and so on. And then 28 was about training, offering face-to-face training about LGBTQ inclusion. So the conflict of interest with these three items, I think, is not just with women or LGBT people, but might be with anyone/everyone. So signaling pollutes the visual environment of the workplace, and it sends a clear message that is alienating to anyone who doesn't share those politics. So if you're a gay person who endorses TQ ideology, you're probably not going to be all that bothered by a rainbow flag and rainbow lanyards everywhere. But if you're a gay person who rejects that ideology, who finds it regressive and homophobic, then suddenly you're at work everywhere confronted by symbols of a set of beliefs that you reject, and people who you can reasonably assume will be hostile if they know that you disagree with them. So maybe, just a thought, the workplace should be neutral and impartial between competing controversial ideologies, rather than climbing on the bandwagon with whichever is currently the most fashionable. After all, the workplace has a duty of non-discrimination on the grounds of both political belief and religious belief. Maybe it's not quite discrimination to be blasted every day with the signs of your employer and many of your colleagues signaling values you reject, but it's certainly not a comfortable workplace. And this is somewhat ironic when one of the aims of diversity and inclusion programs for LGBTQ+ people is that they be able to bring their whole selves to work. So why should it be that you can bring your whole self to work only if you agree with the prevailing set of values or beliefs, and you can't if you don't? This is especially pressing for bodies like universities, whose most fundamental commitments require pluralism of thought. Now note that items 1 of section 2, encouraging the use of an external expert, which can be Pride and Diversity themselves, and item 28, encouraging face-to-face training, whether LGBTQ+ awareness training or ally training, maybe these two may be the most obvious points at which the ideology is brought into the institution. And Kit's YouTube channel has examples of training that cautions against, for example, the use of the word mother. Finally, note that in the submission documents, there is a section here, this one, on negative press/complaints disclosure. It asks employers to disclose negative media relating to an LGBTQ issue. Well, you probably can't see that now, but just trying to fit it all in. So the company can lose up to 25 points, that's here, for a negative event, at least where the Pride and Diversity group don't deem there to have been sufficient remedial action taken by the employer. And 25 points is a lot of points, considering that most of the items we've talked about so far are worth between 2 and 4 points each. The grievance officer, for example, is only worth 3 points, and yet it might end up costing the employer, say at the university, given the sort of salary scales, maybe it's going to cost around $100,000 a year in salary. Be different for different employers. So the thought is that this threat of having 25 points docked may well lead companies to suppress controversial work that may be reported as a negative media incident, even if that's unfair reporting, or it may lead them to remedy that incident in a way that is unfair to the employee, and yet it would satisfy the AWEI. And I think at particular risk are gender-critical employees, employees whose religious beliefs conflict with some of the ideology of the LGBTQ training or workplace inclusion measures, and who might be interested to speak out against those measures, conservative employees, and other dissidents from left orthodoxy. And just note that universities in particular tend to be heavily left biased already. Okay, so final thing I wanted to comment on and said I would come back to is this question of who's to blame here. So I think it's interesting that there's very little by way of explicit encoding of gender identity ideology in the actual AWEI documents. The way that the items are worded makes it perfectly possible that workplaces could participate in this scheme in a way that doesn't create a conflict of interest. So for example, a workplace like mine could decide that it doesn't want to get points for stopping collecting data on sex, because it needs to keep collecting data on sex to meet its other obligations. So for example, obligations to gender equality benchmarking schemes or for their own internal purposes. It could also be that some of the conflicts are being created by the fact that workplaces are signed up to only one diversity and inclusion scheme. So if it's this one, then LGBTQ people are getting a disproportionate amount of the diversity and inclusion budget and attention. But that need not be the case. Your employer could sign up to the AWEI and also offer all employees 10 days of paid leave for whatever purpose they like, to match the 10 days that they're offering for gender affirmation leave, that they're incentivized to offer by the AWEI for gender affirmation leave. It's just that they don't do that. And maybe the reason the workplace doesn't do that is that they just don't think about how unfair it is, or they don't think about the other groups that might need such leave more. So for example, women suffering from recurring and painful health issues like endometriosis. It's also worth noting that there's a lot of good stuff in the AWEI, like making sure LGBTQ people are fully included in parental leave policies and incentivizing employers to offer advice about safe travel where travel is required for work, given that homosexuality is still illegal in so many countries. So my impulse at the end of all this is to place less blame with the AWEI and more blame with the employers who participate in it uncritically. they should think more about how some of the items create a conflict of interest with other workplace minority groups, and this may be different groups depending on the employer and the relevant industry that they're in. And employers should think about whether there are other groups that need diversity and inclusion representation, or even would just benefit from some of the specific measures put in place to earn points on one of these items. So as Alan Davison put it at the University of Melbourne event, which by the way should be broadcast soon on the ABC's Big Ideas program, companies shouldn't be outsourcing their moral conscience to external diversity and inclusion schemes.